The title of my talk is Sensitive Moral Semantics, Neo-Aristotelian Ethical Naturalism, and Context-Shifting Arguments. And as the title might suggest, in the following talk, I will bring context-shifting arguments from the philosophy of language to bear on an important set of generics that are held by Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalists to play an important role in moral judgments, vital descriptions. I argue that though there may exist reasons to doubt the force of such arguments in language more generally, one such strong counterargument against them, however, does not seem to apply to generics that characterize our species. The structure of my talk will proceed as follows. I will begin by describing context-shifting arguments and show what they mean for vital descriptions. I will then turn towards Cappelen and Lepore's response to context-shifting style arguments and show that there are features of Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalism that circumvents this challenge, what they call the mistaken assumption. If this is right, then at least the prima facie plausibility of contextualism about moral sentences is preserved. I conclude with a brief comment on why I don't think this necessarily commits Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalism to a sort of anti-realist relativism in the moral sphere. So section 1, the context-shifting argument and vital descriptions. So these arguments in the philosophy of language generally take on the following form. Take one particular sentence P. As demonstrated by the sentence potentially bearing different truth values in two different contexts, it would seem that the content of what the sentence bears depends upon the context of utterance. So as Charles Travis writes, take, for example, the English Sid grunts, spoken of Sid at a particular time. Sid has been in an accident. The fear is that he's lost his ability to grunt. Yet Pia gives him a sharp blow in the solar plexus, and he responds with a grunt, to which Pia reports correctly by saying, Sid grunts. By contrast, Pia and Zoe are planning a soiree. Pia would prefer Sid not to come. He knows too much. So she says, don't invite Sid. Sid grunts. But Sid is the most urbane of men. He has no such habit. So Pia speaks mendaciously, so falsely. It's Charles Travis's example there. And the idea here is that the utterance, Sid grunts, is true of the actual world in one instance, namely Sid having just received a sharp blow to the solar plexus and uttering a noise, and yet false in another, where he is accused of making the same such sounds as he did upon receiving the blow, yet in an uncouth manner. Due intuition that such pairs are meant to invoke is the idea that the meaning of the sentence is, in fact, context dependent, else by reductio it would turn out that there is no meaning to the sentence at all. Semantic content, as such, would be dependent on context. While this question of semantics is generally important, there are features of Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalism that results in a special attention for which the question of contextualism is especially pertinent. The challenge arises from the role of vital descriptions in this approach towards ethics. That is, for Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalists, moral claims are simply descriptive judgments about natural goodness as applied to humans. What it means to ascribe some virtue upon an agent, then, is actually no different from what we might do to a non-human animal or plant. And likewise, the assessment of a single individual of the species relates to the generic as such. Take, for example, Michael Thompson's example of a box jellyfish. To recognize that a box jellyfish is swimming well references the generic life form of the box jellyfish. To be sure, we can only recognize the movements of the tentacles as something involving the act of a box jellyfish, and not necessarily, to put it in his words, not parasites or cancerous excrescences of unattached bits of waste, with a picture of the form of the jellyfish, tentacles and all, in mind. And the attribution of the vital description, namely that this jellyfish swims well, will, in all utterances, be a question of whether or not this particular jellyfish in question fits towards the natural standard of the species or the life form. This relation is putatively preserved when we make moral judgments. Human vital descriptions are structurally no different on this view. However, because our characteristic activity is rational activity, our moral assessments of humans will necessarily consider said features of our lives the same way that fauna adds to considerations of flora locomotion. Thus, an ascription of someone as a, for example, performer of brave acts is a paradigmatic example of a moral vital description, involves considering what bravery consists of against a backdrop of a human life form and human flourishing qua rational animal. But rationality, of course, also complicates things. Take, for example, vital descriptions that deal with the ends of survival. As Rosalind Herseth points out in her explication of Philippa Foot's idea of the sea change brought on by the onset of reason, to quote her, that might well kill me is a consideration we need to recognize as a reason for action, and as a reason of a certain weight, frequently compelling in order to live well and live the good human life, because we need to recognize it in order to live at all. But note that nothing immediately follows from this about action, or in the term she uses, she's referencing Foot here, for the animal's operations. So that was Rosalind Hurst says. So considerations of our ethological ends don't determine our actions. Rather, they're reasons that we must take into consideration when choosing how to act. Nothing necessitates any particular action as one being connected to bravery or any other virtue, aside from the fact that relevant reasons within the domain of that virtue are reflected in the act. Whether an agent has acted bravely, then, seems to be, at minimum, context sensitive about a particular agent, her motivations, her preferences, and so forth. In short, human flourishing is not as rigid as what non-rational flourishing consists of. And given the conceptual connection between flourishing and the virtues, the latter are constitutive of the former, the multiple realizability of the former pulls against a context-independent understanding of our vital descriptions. The idea in sum is this: our ethological ends form reasons for acting, but do not wholly determine which actions fittingly fall under vital descriptions. Rather, being underdetermined, part of what fills them in, and what answers what reasons are good reasons, are incidental features regarding or come from the context of judgment. As such, because for these incidental reasons, we may just as good reason to follow them or ignore them, an agent who is said to perform brave acts in one context just as easily could be falsely ascribed said vital description in another, despite performing one and the same action. Bracketing aside considerations of whether or not there is actually one such notion of bravery, the idea is that, at least at face value, shifting the context in which something like bravery is discussed seems to alter the semantic content of a statement like Sid does brave acts. So section 2, is there a mistaken assumption about moral semantics? So how might we resist such arguments? Well, in the context of language, particularly robust treatment of these forms of arguments comes from the semantic minimalists, namely Cappelen and Lepore. They suggest that the force of context-shifting arguments rests upon a mistaken assumption that, to quote them, a theory of semantic content is adequate just in case it accounts for all or most of the intuitions speakers have about speech act content. That is, intuitions about what speakers say, assert, claim, and state by uttering sentences. So in other words, what they're accusing contextualists of is that there's an error in connecting the content of Sid grunts to Pia, who is making these utterances in two different contexts. Instead, they propose a sort of speech act pluralism, that a particular utterance of the statement itself can say a plurality of things. So Pia, in striking Sid and making her declaration, says something in uttering Sid grunts, and Pia, speaking in such a way to cause mistaken beliefs about Sid, also says something in uttering Sid grunts. But for Cappelen and Lepore, these are different things that she is saying. Both speech acts, however, can be extricated from the proposition Sid grunts, about which we can derive semantic content independent of the context. The question then is whether or not there might be a similar move that can be made about moral context-shifting arguments. The point, if we follow Cappelen and Lepore in rejecting the mistaken assumption, is that Pia saying that Sid performs brave acts does not necessarily commit the content of the sentence, independent of the context of her saying so, to anything. The semantic content of the sentence can come apart from the utterance, and the alleged moral mistaken assumption here is, mutatis mutandum, the suggestion that the semantics of a moral assertion must account for particular judgments themselves. And just as the mistaken assumption suggests that speech acts might connect to different propositions depending on the context-dependent natural understanding, perhaps the trouble with moral semantic contextualism, in the case of vital descriptions, is the suggestion that they conflate the particular judgments with particular descriptions. But how plausible is such an assertion about moral judgments, as opposed to general speech acts? I think if one is committed to the Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalist picture of life, then one challenge to this understanding is that notions associated with human life only exist within the context of human institutions. This is especially brought up by Anscombe's discussion of the notion of debt. As she observes, there's nothing about the actual background facts of a situation that entails a customer owing payment, save against the backdrop of human institutions of exchange. To quote her, owing requires these are very similar institutions as background in order so much to be the kind of statement that it is. The allegation of a mistaken assumption is a powerful one if contextualism is motivated by the fact that the context of the utterance is what leads to the apparent difference in truth value or correctness. And the force of such arguments comes from recognition that a speech act can and does refer to a multitude of different propositions, wherein context sets out which of these propositions constitutes a natural understanding of what is said. The analogous moral mistaken assumption hits the mark if it happens to be the case that the content of the descriptions of bravery pick out different understandings of it. But this is expressly not what is doing the work here for moral utterances. Rather, Anscombe's discussion is meant to show that contextualism about terms associated with human lives, including virtue terms, exists at a deeper level. To say anything at all about human vital descriptions is to implicitly presume a particular context, within which reason is developed and specific reasons are rendered fitting. The force of the moral context shifting argument derives from that specific institutional context are themselves actually constitutive of reason organizing our life form activities in certain ways. And so the content of the sentence cannot be so easily separated from the context. I have, for example, in mind, Anscombe's discussion of promising as understood more generally as a need to be able to coordinate our actions with the future, as another example in which something can be multiply realizable. So to conclude, if my discussion above is correct, then it seems like even if we accept arguments against contextualism generally for language, it does not necessarily give us cause to reject contextualism about vital description sentences. I do want to conclude by noting some further points of exploration called for by what I've raised in brief here. Namely, that whether adopting contextualism considering vital descriptions about humans runs the risk of committing Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalists to a sort of anti-realist relativism. The argument for such a claim might run something like follows. If the semantic content of virtue terms is dependent on context, it would follow here that there is nothing real to these terms at all. What constitutes these terms is just a matter of social convention. And the virtues are descriptions of nothing more than what a particular cultural upbringing, for example, values. Against this, recall that just as reason means we needn't be committed to rigid ends like non-rational locomotive life, we can still take a step back and examine whether any particular conception actually is a correct usage. For example, any such conceptions that are fundamentally incompatible with necessary claims about human form, such as the fact that we're all necessarily vulnerable beings at certain points in our life, and that our social relations entail vulnerability, would constitute an incorrect usage of said terms. It remains to be seen whether a developed view of this sort might still fall into what Cappelen and Lepore would call a moderate contextualism, and further, whether it would, as they allege, necessarily slip to radical contextualism once more against the realist understanding. Yet, on the other side, this might call into question whether virtue terms, such as bravery, might refer to a specific sort of reason responsiveness that takes as an input to contextual considerations, thereby rendering Sid does brave acts non-contextualist yet again. However, this would require squaring with the McDowellian insight, contra more, for example, Kantian transcendental notions that the perfected reason is a second nature, and so develops within particular contexts. In this sense, propositions made by Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalists seem both context sensitive and yet answerable to something that transcends context. I think this is fertile grounds for further discussion and further consideration of the implications of language on ethics. Thank you.